So as we were discussing earlier, every behavior is preceded by a antecedent or a stimulus, and followed by a consequence. And so when a student is presented with a stimulus, he should be able to respond. However, sometimes kiddos don't respond, or they respond erroneously. And so at that point, a prompt is needed to elicit a correct response. And so a prompt is a behavior targeted at eliciting a child to respond correctly in a way appropriate to the child's communication capabilities. In essence, a response prompt is meant to increase the probability that the child will respond appropriately or correctly. So what exactly do prompts look like? There are gestural prompts, and these are nonverbal prompts, such as pointing, head nods, and hand motions. You also have verbal prompts, and so some examples of these might be telling a child, read the word restroom or turn the page, or something a little bit more indirect, such as, how do we keep the story going? And so you have direct verbal prompts and indirect verbal prompts where you tell the child exactly what to do, or you sort of give an idea of what the child might have to do after. So the next prompt is pictorial or visual prompts. And an example of this might be simply having visuals to prompt the child, or even just having picture schedules of the events of the day for the child to know what's happening next and sort of how to proceed throughout the day. Model prompts, examples of these include peer or teacher demonstrating a target behavior. And you have physical prompts, with there being partial physical prompts or full physical prompts. And an example of a partial would be sort of moving the elbow of a child to sort of move them forward to do something. And then a full physical prompt might be more hand over hand to prompt the child to do something such as writing. And then there are mixed prompts, which is simply means doing multiple of these prompts that were mentioned. And so an example would be pointing to the response options and then repeating a question or a comprehension question or whatever question may have been asked. So as far as response prompts, they actually exist on a continuum, which is referred to as prompting hierarchy. So we have the least assistance or least intrusion prompts, and then we have the most intrusion prompts. And so what this means is pretty much a system where least intrusive prompts are those that the child is able to do with those prompts that are not as intrusive. So you provide less assistance, whereas most intrusive prompts, you provide the most assistance. And so let's go ahead and discuss sort of the hierarchy, which is what comes into play with a few of the strategies that we've listed here. So least to most prompts are those where the assistance is increased. And so you go from least intrusive to most intrusive prompts. The teacher sort of progresses through the prompt hierarchy, first with simply providing the natural cue or the instruction. If the child responds correctly, then you provide the reinforcement. If the child responds incorrectly, you provide the next prompt, which would be a more intrusive or more assistance prompt. And so you would go sort of from gesture to verbal to visual to modeling to then providing physical assistance, whether partial or full. And so the goal of the least to most prompts, or increasing the assistance, it's really ensuring that the child is able to provide a response before a prompt is even administered. And so that's the goal of this one particular strategy within the prompts hierarchy. The other prompts hierarchy strategy is most to least prompts. And so this one is where you decrease the assistance. You go from most intrusive to least intrusive prompts. Biggest difference between the two is you really are able to remain at one prompt level for several sessions. But in this case, you would start with the most intrusive, which we can give the example of sort of doing hand over hand or providing a full or partial physical prompt, and then working your way backwards to provide fewer and fewer prompts for the child to be able to respond more independently eventually. We also have time delay. So time delay is where the prompt is faded using increments of time. So you provide the instruction, and then you allow, initially you provide the instruction, and then there's 0 delay with the prompt. And so you can provide the instruction together with the prompt. And so it might be something like, what color? Red. And so at that point, you've immediately provided sort of the prompt for the child to know what the color is in that case. If you were then to delay it, if the child is not able to do so, to respond, you would then provide another prompt, but with more delay. And so it might be 2 to 4 seconds, and then allowing the child to respond at that point. The child responds, you then provide a reinforcement. So that one type of time delay is constant time delay, where you just provide a specific amount of time every single time where you're delaying the time frame between the instruction and the prompt. For the other one is the progressive time delay. And so that strategy is where you still delay the prompt, but you progressively delay it more and more to allow the child more time and opportunity to be able to respond without the prompting. And that might be initially a 0 delay between the instruction and the prompt. And then if the child is not able to respond, providing the instruction again, but delaying it 2 seconds. For the next round, instruction, but delaying it 4 seconds, and so on and so forth. Typically, you may have a capped ceiling of how much time you're providing. Essentially, an example would be 8 seconds. And so that would be the highest amount of time that you would be waiting for the child to respond. So something else that's very important to keep in mind is prompt dependency. And so in this comic strip, the sister tells the brother, when somebody gives you something, you wait for them to say, and what do you say? And then you say thank you. So prompt dependency pretty much is when students are needing a prompt in order to initiate a skill or activity when they have already, one that they have already mastered. And so usually this happens when there are too many prompts in place and the child becomes dependent upon those prompts. So what's needed to be done is to gradually fade away those prompts once the child is able to master the target behavior or the final skill, and obviously monitoring those the performance of the child to ensure that you're not providing too few prompts where the child is then making errors, or too many prompts where the child is then becoming too dependent upon these prompts. And so how exactly do we then go about fading these prompts? There are 3 dimensions across which we can fade away the prompts. One is the force of the prompts. And so that would mean how much help is being provided. And so that goes from high to low to be able to fade it. So from full physical to partial physical to possibly modeling and then verbal. So sort of fading the prompt along that continuum. One example that I can think of, and usually verbal prompts are the hardest to fade, but one way that could potentially be done within force would be sort of providing the prompt, as I mentioned earlier, what color is this? Red. And then what color is this? And then what color is this? And so you're fading the verbal prompt in that sense, and therefore fading the force of the prompt. An additional way to be able to fade prompts is through timing, which we discussed earlier, the time delay, where you provide a prompt immediately, what color is this? Red. Or you provide the prompt with a delay. What color is this? Red. And so that's another way to be able to fade prompts. And then prompts can also be faded within sort of the spatial or distance dimension. And so that would be teaching the child or giving the child the prompt right beside the child. and then little by little fading it so that you're further and further from the child, either behind the child or completely away from the child, and providing the prompt in that way. And this is considered stimulus fading, which is just gradually reducing the prompt itself. Again, I can't emphasize how important it is to monitor the child's progression to ensure that the fading is being successful, and that it's not being faded too soon or too slow, where the child then becomes either prompt dependent because it's being faded too slowly, or the child makes errors in learning because it's being faded too quickly. Some additional implications: the type of prompt that's being used is going to depend on the skill being taught and the abilities of the child, him or herself. Avoid unintentional prompts. So sometimes positioning of materials, or our voice inflection, or facial expression. So things such as, is it blue or red? And so our facial expressions and our voice inflection may give it away for the child, and those may be unintentional prompts. And then not changing the order of concepts of instruction. All prompts also need to be faded over time. So as we mentioned earlier, scaffolds and scaffolds are really just a temporary structure to be able to facilitate learning. But in essence, our ultimate goal is to have the child be able to respond independently to the task at hand. And so those need to be faded over time. Again, if prompts are faded too quickly, errors may occur. And so it's important to fade those prompts gradually. As prompts are faded, always remember to reinforce more and more independent responses or successive approximations to the target behavior that we want to see. And then highly reinforce all unprompted responses. We definitely want the child to know that we want them to respond more independently. So one simple way to collect the data, and we did mention about how important it is to the data collection, is simply writing the date, keeping track of the date of when the prompt was provided, whether the prompt was provided, and then whether the actual scale was reached. Was a child able to respond after receiving or not receiving the prompt? You may simply write yes or no as far as the provision of the prompt, or you may actually write in the type of prompt that was provided to keep track of being able to fade the prompt as far as force, so going through the hierarchy of prompts. Some resources that might be very useful are the MAST modules, and those really go into explaining prompting systems and task analyses, and so that's a really good resource. And then the Tennessee Behavior Supports Project at Vanderbilt created a great PDF that talks about prompting sequencing, and then some tips for that. And so that's another really good resource that I recommend for behavioral scaffolding strategies.